In Mirz Hashem Daf Yud Ches, on the last line of Yud Zayin Amid Beis, and the Gemara is continuing to analyze the Takanas Chachamim of Zman Beget. Why do we require Zman Beget? Amar le Ravino Rava, Kasve, if he writes the get, the Osve Bekiste, and he puts it into his wallet or his bag. And his intention was the Ima Faisa, if let's say he'll make amends with his wife and they'll get over their altercation, to Fayes, then he will be appeased or she'll be appeased, and he's not going to divorce her. However, unfortunately, even though he tried perhaps to make peace, he did not succeed. And many moons after the Zman that's written in the get, he decides to marry her. To divorce her, meaning that there's no way of salvaging the marriage. What's the din in this case? It would seem that on the one hand, the Gerushin cannot be chal until he actually gives the get into her hand, because of love and us on law, he's got to give it to her into her hand. So that the Zman on the get in this case is an earlier Zman. It's what we call a shtar mukdam. Now the trouble with this get is that he can sort of be in collusion with her, meaning the Zman is written earlier, and the get would testify that on the earlier date, let's say a month ago, she was already divorced. And what that means is what's called Shem Yechape Oleho. Let's say, for example, she had a relationship with another man during that month. The get would sort of prove that she was already divorced before she had that relationship. And for one reason or another, he decides that he'll try to help her get off the hook. Or alternatively, she can collect peiros from lekuchos shelo Gittin. What does that mean? She has rights to the fruits of hanechasim, which was sold by her husband at the time of the get. And in truth, she didn't acquire ownership over those peiros because the get was not given to her at that time. But nobody knows that. So what happens is, let's say somebody purchased a piece of property from the Baal, she's going to take this get and she's going to prove that her ownership over the nechasim of the Baal predated the rights of these lekuchos to purchase the land. In other words, she had kinyonim already from the time, let's say at the first of the month. They purchased the land on the 15th of the month. In fact, she wasn't divorced until the 30th day of the month. So therefore, the Gemara is objecting, what did you really gain over here by establishing a Zman in the get? Okay, fine. The original intention of the Baal was to divorce her at the original moment, the earlier moment at the first of the month. But once you establish the Zman of the get, in event that he changes his mind and he delays delivering the get until a month later, then the Zman of the get is going to actually work against us, because he can allow for chibui and she could collect from lekucho shelo Gittin. So this was the question that Ravina asked Rava. So Rava responds to Ravina, and he says the following: Lo makdim inish puranuso linafshe. The Rabbanan made this takon of Zman predicated on the premise that a person would not write a get in this kind of a way. A person does not start with peronios, meaning with the assumption that he's going to divorce his wife. until he's actually, finalized that decision, and he's, shall we say, he has used every leaf in the world, in the books, to try to stave off the divorce. And in the translation that I have here, he says, Ein adam makdim lahavi puranis al atzmo. So therefore, in this case, we're afraid that he brought puranis al atzmo b'hakdama. What are we saying? That he didn't want to get. And he was really hoping that maybe they could reconcile their differences and remain married. And yet he wrote a get with that early zman, which would mean that in event that he does divorce, so then the divorce starts earlier. It doesn't really start earlier, but it looks like it starts earlier. So therefore, Rava responds to Ravina that we don't have to worry about this possibility that such a scenario happened, and he wrote the get even before he had actually decided to deliver the get and terminate the marriage. It's what we call ein hadavar motzui. So when the Chachamim made the takana of Zman, they didn't worry about this. They didn't take into consideration the scenario that you, Ravina, are presenting. And I think, in my humble opinion, what's going on here in this sugya is that when she's holding on to the get and there are Eidim signed on the get, that get as a star in her hands proves that everything in the get is accurate, is authentic, is true and reliable, including the Zman. So you're right, you could always come up with a chashash, and therefore this get is, problematic. But no, she's holding on to the get. A man doesn't usually, write a get before he's decided that he's going to divorce his wife, and therefore the get itself, with the Zman, is a valid testimony that that's exactly when the gerushin happened. Although, again, the scenario is theoretically possible, but the get in her hand, together with this, how should we say, umdana, that lo mag diminish purnasel and afshi, therefore the get is made and it testifies on her behalf that the zman of the get is accurate. And he gave her the get as is written in the zman of the get. So what I'm suggesting is that, let's say in a secular law, in a secular court, you could have a contested zman, meaning, let's say I produce a document in a secular court, you could contest that this document is not accurate because the date written in the document is not reflective of what really happened. And perhaps there'll be a give and take, and maybe, I don't know who would have the burden of proof in order to establish that the date on the document is correct. But in halachic terms, as opposed to other systems of law, the shtar itself has its own power. And the halacha relies on everything that's written in the document, including the zman. Now we have another scenario. The same Ravina comes up with another scenario. Amalei Ravina, in this case, he's talking to Rav Ashi. Gittin haboim mimdinas hayam. A get comes from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, the Michtavei bin Nisan. And it was written way back in Nisan. But again, the Shliach has to transport the get from, let's say, Toronto in Canada all the way to Yerushalayim, or somewhere in Eretz Yisrael at that time when transportation was very complicated. And perhaps it took an entire half a year from Nisan, on the date in which the get was written back in Toronto, until Lo Moto Ad Tishrei, until 6 months later in Tishrei, the get reaches the hand of the woman. So the Zman of the get is written on Chodesh Nisan, but the actual Gerushin was not Chal until the get reached her hand in the month of Tishrei 6 months later. Is again the old question, Ma ho'ilu chacham v'takanosam. What is the positive significance of writing the get? On the contrary, it's a negative significance, because we have to be choshish, number one, that the Baal could be machape oleha, and he's going to claim that she already received the get at the earlier date, so that at the time of this news she was already divorced, and we have to be choshesh that she'll collect from the peiros that the husband had already sold, and she'll claim her rights to those peiros date back to the Zman of the get, that's back in Nisan, and she's going to go and claim these peiros from the hands of the Lekuchos who actually purchased the peiros, Kedasu Gittin. And once again, the pattern of the Gemara is going to have to be that we're not afraid of such a scenario. We don't consider it as probable and as likely. Omale Ravina responds to Rav Ashi, Hanu Kola Islahu. With regard to a get that's coming from Toronto all the way to Eretz Yisrael, there's a kol, there's a pirsum, there's some sort of element of publicity. Everybody knows that in a case of a get that's coming from so far away, we cannot rely on the Zman written in the get. We know that the Zman Aksiva is way, way earlier than the Zman Mesiras HaGet. So if she wants to prove that these witnesses who testify that she had an adulterous relationship are really testifying after she was already divorced, the burden of proof is on her to base her proof on the Zman written in the get, because we know that the Zman written in the get is not accurate. Everybody knows that it's coming from Chutz La'aretz over the course of a long distance, long period of time, and therefore the Zman is not reliable. Not only that, once the Lekuchos have purchased the peiros from the Baal, and she wants to now be Motzi, is HaMotzi Mechal V'Araya. The fact that she has the Zman in the get is not going to be ample proof for her to rip away those nechas and those peiros from the hands of the Lekuchos. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what's called Havchana. Havchana means that from the moment a woman either loses her husband or receives a get from her husband to the time that she wants to get remarried, she's got to wait a minimum of 3 months. Because during that 3-month period, in event that she's pregnant from her first husband, the one who died or the one who divorced her, she'll already be showing. So we'll know that the Vlad that's born is the son of her ex-husband or her late husband. So now, Itmar, we learned the following thing. When do we start counting the 3 months of Havchana, as we called it, in a case of a gerushin? Do we start counting it from the moment that the get was written or from the moment that the get was actually delivered? And you and I, of course, would intuitively say it's got to be from the time that it was delivered into her hands, because before that, she's still married. Itmar, we have Machlokas Amoraim between Shmuel and Rab Nosson on this very point. Me'ema Simonim get, from what date do we start counting? Does the clock start ticking on the 3 months that allow her to get remarried? Rav Amar Mishas Nesina. Well, Rav is telling us that which is intuitive. She's not divorced until she receives the get. Ushmuel Amar Mishas Ksiva, meaning Shmuel's assuming that already when the get was written, he will abstain from any relationship with his wife, and therefore you could begin counting the 3 months from the time of the ksiva. Maskif lo Rav Nosson bar Hoshaya l'Shmuel. Oh, actually, Rav Nosson is the one who seems to side with Rav here against Shmuel. Again, what is Rav Nosson going to object here to Shmuel? We're going to count the 3 months of Havchana from the time of the Ksivas Haget. Now, let's say a man was married to 2 wives, and he travels to Medina Sayyam, and he sends 2 Gittin to both his wives on the same day. However, the Zman that is written on the get that he gave to the Sofer to write the get earlier than the Zman on the second get. So even though both Gittin are being sent simultaneously, yet one get was written before, earlier than the other get. So let's say, for example, there's a discrepancy of, let's say, 2 months. And Yomru, now the people are going to say, Shtei noshim b'chotzer achas, zu asura v'zu muteres. Could it be that according to Shmuel, there are 2 wives of one husband? They were both divorced on the same day, and yet one of them is going to be allowed to get remarried and the other not allowed to get remarried. Because the spectator has no idea that he wrote the get to Rachel earlier than he wrote the get to Leah. All they see is that Rachel and Leah are both receiving their respective Gittin on the same day. So why is Rachel able to get married, allowed to get married earlier than Leah? Now, the Gemara is putting a great deal of emphasis here on the spectator. So I'm not exactly sure why. I have a suspicion that this Gemara is based on Zilusa de Beit Dina. I'm not sure. That people might make fun of the Bezdin. Let me just see what he quotes here from the Bechor Shor. Oh, I was Machame. He says, Ein lifsok davar shehu tamua lechol adam. We don't issue a ruling that will be unacceptable and won't be understood by the people out there, which I believe is what we call zilusa de Beit Dina. Amalei Abai, so Abai responds to Rav Nosson that it's true that both of these women, these wives of Rachel and Leah, received their gerushin on the same day. But you know what? The spectator is going to understand very well why one is allowed to get remarried before the other. He won't stand there with an open mouth, gaping and wondering what logical sense could this make. Why? Bazman Gita Mochiach Olel. Each one of these 2 ladies, Rachel and Leah, has a different zman on the get. And they know, again, I'm not exactly sure how they know this, but the Dayanim on the Bezdin will probably leak out this secret that Rachel has a date on her get that's a month before that of Leah. And if that be the case, then Rachel's allowed to get married a month before Leah. And Zu's man Gita Mochiach Leah. And with regard to Leah, who has a later date, they'll understand very well that from that date we count 3 months. And again, this is all according to Shmuel, that Avchana begins with the date that's written in the Shtar. Tanya, Kavasei de Rav. Tanya, Kavasei de Shmuel. Tanya, Kavasei de Rav. Hasholeach get leishto v'nishtaya. Hashliach b'derech shlosha chadoshim. Imagine, on his way over to Israel, he stopped by Dubai, and he's having a great time over there. So it took him another 3 months until he actually got his act together. And Mishegia get liyada tzrichel hamtin shlosha chadoshim. This is exactly Rab's shita, that we start ticking the clock from the moment she receives the get. So even though, according to Shmuel, in this particular scenario, the moment that she receives the get, she would be allowed to get remarried because the Zman on the get is a full 3 months earlier. But according to Rav, we have a problem here because we have to start counting the 3 months from the time she receives the get. And the Shliach only brings the get and transmits it to the Isha 3 months down the line. But now the Brisa wants to ask a different question, and that's called the get yoshan. What's a get yoshan? A get yoshan is when a man writes a get, and then after the get was written, but before he actually delivers the get, he goes into a private place, a secluded room, locked room with his wife before she receives the get. And in such a case, we assume that when he was in that secluded, locked up room with his wife, he had a relationship with her. And that relationship, according to the halacha, is what's called a bittul lishma shebeget. It's like he's removing the lishma from the get. The lishma from the get has to be generated from the time of the ksiva and continue to be chal every single second until the get is actually delivered to the isha. But if he has a relationship with his wife in between, this reminds us of the Gemara in Sota, where he's not naki miyama, she doesn't drink for the Mei Sota, but that's not what I'm talking about here. But the fact that he had a relationship with her, or we suspect he did, that itself is a bittul lishma shebeget. But in this case, that the shliach is on his way with the get, and he stops by at one of his favorite places, and he stays there for 3 months, we're not going to suspect, we have no witnesses that say that the husband had any relationship with his wife. After all, he's out there in Toronto, Canada, in Pearson Airport, and she's over here in Israel. So there's no chashash of a get yoshan. Sharei lo nisyachirim. Okay, now we have a brisa to support Shmuel. Tanya kavasi the Shmuel amashlish get liishto. What happens is he puts the get into escrow, so to speak. In other words, he leaves the get after it was written in the hands of a shalish. And the function of the shalish for which he was appointed is to hand over the get to his wife. Yomi lo, but he says, the Baal to the shalish, Al titneu la el yachar shlosha chadashim. I don't want you to deliver this get before 3 months passes. Now the get is taken by the shliach. He's on his way. Mishanas the law. He waits 3 months and then he delivers the get. Now, at what point is she allowed to get remarried? Well, according to Rav, she can't get remarried until the get reaches the hands of the Isha 3 months later. But the Brisa says, Muteres li nosemiyad. The very moment she receives the get, and 3 months have passed by since the writing of the get, she's allowed to get remarried. An explicit proof for the Shita Shmuel that we count Yemei Avchana from the time that the get was written, even though it wasn't delivered for a long time later. And once again, as the Brises we saw earlier, Ein Choshin Leget Yoshan Ein Chosh. Shrei lo nisyachirim. How do we paskin in this machlokes regarding Avchana? Rav Kahana, Rav Papi, Rav Ashi, Avdi Mishas Ksiva. They paskin like Shmuel. Rav Papa, the Rav Huna, Berei, the Rav Yeshua, Avdi Mishas Nesino, like Rav. Now, it's very interesting to me that Rav Papi, I think, is one of the 10 sons of Rav Papa. You have to open up a siyum. No, maybe not. Maybe I'm making a mistake. The Hilchasa, what's the final bottom line? Mishas Ksiva. We paskin lekula like Shmuel. In other words, we're not afraid that this woman is pregnant months later, because once the get was written, and we assume the Baal, has made a final decision that he's not going to live with her anymore, therefore she doesn't become pregnant. Okay. Now we get to a sugya of Shemitah. So we have two categories of Shemitah. We have Shemitah's Karka, and that's not relevant to our sugya, but we also have Shemitah's Ksafim. And that means that if Reuven borrows money from Shimon, and it matters not whether or not there was a shtar written up from Reuven, the Love, to Shimon the Malveh, or it was Balpeh, then the law is that Shemitah breaks up that chov, unless you make a prusbul. Now, let's say a man divorces his wife before the Shemitah. Now he owes her the ksuba. Does the woman forfeit her rights to collect the ksuba with Shemitah because Shemitah breaks up the chov?
Right.
And the answer is no. It does not break up the chov. And this he sends you to the Rambam in Perek Tes Milchas Shemitah. Now, when it says that Shemitah is not Meshamit Chov of the Ksuba, it includes everything. What does that mean? There's the Ikar Ksuba, the one of Masayim. Then there's Tosefes Ksuba. And that's the amount of money that he adds above and beyond the required Mana Masayim. Now the Gemara is going to quote a Machlokas Amoraim. At what point in time does the Ksuba actually become a chov that lends itself to hashmatas shmita? Itmar me'emasai ksuba mishametes Rav Omar mishetifgom. When a divorced woman demands payment of her ksuba, then even if she only demands a partial payment, let's say the ksuba is worth masayim, she asks for 50 out of the 200. At that moment in time that she demanded a piron of the ksuba, that's a gili das that she is omedes ligosh bebal, that she's about to be noges the Baal, meaning to demand money from him or from his yarshim in the event that he died. Betizkov, and therefore the balance of the ksuba, of what she hasn't yet collected, becomes a chov b'halva. It's like as if the money has been taken out of the ksuba. Once she begins to collect a ksuba, even the balance that she hasn't yet collected is already removed from the ksuba, and it becomes an outstanding chov, and therefore lends itself to shmitas ksafim. Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel Omar, Pagma, Afal Pishlo Zok. Once she begins to collect the money of her ksuba, and she reveals her das, that she's going to be, so to speak, proverbially, hounding the Baal or his heirs to pay the rest of the ksuba, then it becomes like a malva, because the process of yigos has begun, and therefore Shemitah is mishami. But afal pi shelo zokfa. So far, Shmuel is agreeing with Rav. Now, lo zokfa means they didn't write a separate shtar on the balance. Let's say she collected now 50, he owes her from the ksuba another 150. They didn't write a separate shtar on this balance chov. Zakva, afal pishlo pagma, but in the case of zakva, then Shemitah is giving Meshavit the chov, even though she has not collected a single grush from the ksuba. Why? Because it's a case of zakva. And zakva, I think, if I understand correctly, means that the ksuba was now converted into a shtar and makes it into a halva, as it's a separate halva. Okay, now in the footnote, he writes that there was a Maisa Bezdin. Now, what does that mean, a Maisa Bezdin? Just one second. Apparently, again, I'm taking a little bit of a leap of faith over here. There's one step even beyond writing a shtar for the purpose of collecting the ksuba, and that's called a Maisa Bezdin. And the purpose and the tokef, the power of a Maisa Bezdin is to protect the chov from shvius. And this has a lot to do, I think, with pruzbul. So if Bezdin writes a psak din that he owes her the ksuba, then that chov, that halva, is protected and is impervious to the Shemitah power. But it's still unclear to me what the word zakfa means. Do you happen to have an English translation of the word zakfa, maybe with a footnote?
Yeah, it's just one sec. What is the word zakfa? Sorry.
I need like a working definition of the word zakfa.
Partial payment? I think it's partial payment.
No, I think that's pugma. Rav said Misha pugma. And Shmuel said, even if low pugma, there was no partial payment, it was zakfa.
Oh, okay, right. Sorry. The balance, she didn't establish the balance as a loan. So low zakfa. Or she established, yeah, that's what it means. Zakfa bijalo pigma. So she established it, she doesn't accept partial payment.
I don't know what the word established means exactly in this context.
If she established it,
I thought maybe they wrote a separate shtar, but I don't think that's correct.
it sounds, I think
maybe zakfa means they made a calculation or something like that. Exactly how much she should collect.
She's making the ksuba into, it says, a shtar chov, a note of indebtedness.
Oh, he used the word he used the word shtar chov there?
Yeah.
So then he's saying what I said. Oh wow. I don't know. Here in the Masechet, I'm not finding the exact definition of zakfa. Maybe it's going to come up later in the Gemara. I don't know. In any event, again, we have Tanya Kavasi de Rav, Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel, Tanya Kavasi de Rav, Me Emasai Haksuba. At what point does the ksuba become like a shtarchov mishametes? And now we have the first price, which is going to support Rab Misha Tifkon, Vitizkov. So it means from the beginning of the collection of part of the ksuba and a calculation, perhaps with a separate shtar of how much is the balance that he owes her as a milva. But pogma v'lo zokva, zokva lo pogma, eina mishamet tzad v'tisko. So Rav requires both. And this brisa supports Rav. You need both pogma, that she actually collected and pocketed part of it was a partial collection of the ksuba, and also there was zakfa. Then it becomes a chov, and it lends itself to Hashmata Shemitah. But we have these two conditions. Both have to be fulfilled. It's got to be pogma, and it's got to be tizkov. I think what we're saying here, remember we spoke a few minutes ago about a Maisa Bezdin. I think what we're saying is that the ksuba itself is a Maisa Bezdin. Why? Because it's Tnai Ksuba, meaning the Rabbanan set up the marriage on this basis that there's going to be a ksuba. And the ksuba is like a Maisa Bezdin, and that's protected from Shvius and Shemitah. But in the case where they already began the process of collecting the ksuba, and moreover, says Rav, they calculated to the grush, to the last penny, exactly how much he has to pay her, then it becomes ois Maisa Bezdin. It's no longer Maisa Bezdin, but rather becomes halva, and it's subject to Shemitah. Tanya Kavasi the Shmuel, onas uknas. Okay, now we're talking about a person who has to pay because he raped a psula. He has to pay her father. In case of a nara, he has to pay her chamishim kesef. Now we have a case of knas, which is mea kesef. That's a motzi shemer. So he consummates the marriage and he makes a claim that she was under false pretenses, as if she never had a relationship before, but she had a relationship before. And if we can prove that his claim is just a false libel, then he has to pay mea sloim kesef. Then we have pitui, a man who seduces a psula and she has ratzon to have a relationship with him. Then he pays chamishim kesef to the father, and he's got to marry her if she so desires. Uksubas isha, and the ksuba of a woman whose husband died or divorced her, kol elu, all the above, whether it's the chiyuv kamishim of ones, whether it's the chiyuv of mea slime kesef of motzi shemra, or the chamishim kesef of pitui, or the ksubas isha, all of the above is zakfan b'milva meshamtin. As long as there was this establishment called zakfa, which means some sort of calculation, then it becomes a separate shtar, and it's removed from the status of the ksuba. And then Shemitah is meshamed, even though there was no nifkama, even though there was no partial collection at all. And that's going to support Shmuel. V'im lav ein meshamti. So these obligations are also like a Maisa Bezdin, because any kind of punitive payments and knossos are established by the Bezdin. And me'emasain is kafim b'milva. And at what moment is there as kifas milva mishas hamada b'din? Now, hamada b'din, I believe, is when she sues him in a court of law. And hamada b'din already removes the status of the ksuba, for example, and it makes it into a regular milva. Okay, now going back to the Mishnah earlier in this parak, the Mishnah establishes that if a get was written during the day, but it was only after nightfall that it was signed, the get is possible. Why? Because that's called a get mukdam. Because there are two different dates. There's a date of the ksiva and a date of the chasima. Two different calendar dates. Omar Shmuel, ksuba kemaisa bezdin dami. Ksuba is similar to a maisa bezdin, right? Because again, when a person gets married, that's called Tanai Bezdin. Whether he likes it or not, he has to pay the basic ksuba. That's not a matter of decision of yes, no. It's not bedaito biyodo to decide whether he pays the ksuba. It's a maisa bezdin. And ma maisa bezdin, right? You have shtaros that the judges write the final decision when they hand down a verdict, and they write on a shtar ploni chayav l'shalim le'almoni. So those are written nechtovim bayom v'nechtovim balayla. Shmuel claims that there's no psul of a shtar mukdam with regard to a Maisa Bezda, which is a shtar that's written by the Dayanim. And Ploni Chayiv L'Almoni. Now, why is there no psul of shtar mukdam in this case? So let me read to you what he writes here. He says, Mishum shechovas hatashlum hamutelas al misha nimtza chayav Eino machmas hashtar, ela machmas hapsak sheposka dayonim af shelo chasmu al kach. In other words, the dayonim handed down a verdict which hasn't yet been signed to the effect that there's a chiyuv tashlumin, that there's payment that's due. So the obligation to pay that money is already established at the time that Bezdin issues their ruling, even if they haven't yet signed the shtar. So therefore, the fact that the signature of the shtar was implemented on the following day is not a psul in the shtar. It's not a shtar mukdam. So the obligation to pay the ksuba dates back to the moment that Bezdin handed down the ruling, which is the day previously, the earlier day. Af ksuba nechteves bayom v'nechteves balayla. Just like any Maisa Bezdin can be written with an earlier date, so to a ksuba can be written with an earlier date, even though the signature is only the following day. And this is not a psul of shtar mukdam, because everything in this chayvus of the ksuba is generated already by the decision of Bezdin on the earlier date, meaning by Yom. He writes here, Ki ashibu l'kayim es ha'schayvuyos shebeksuba u'machmas hakiruv shel nesuin sheyeshno kvar mishas ksivas ha'ksuba. So I don't know what he means when he says kiruv shel nesuin. Let me just think about that for a minute. Oh, I see what happens. I think he's asking at what point in time is the Baal mischayev to pay the ksuba? Is it only after the ksuba is signed and sealed, or even before that, when it's before the sun sets, it's during the day, and the Baal has already decided that he's mischayev to the ksuba, he's mishabed himself to pay the ksuba. We don't have to wait until the actual signature on the ksuba. That's what he calls kiruv shel nesuin. So the fact that the chasima on the shtar is a day later is not a problem. This is the statement of Shmuel. Now, this has tremendous repercussions. As a Masada Kiddushin, we always try as hard as we can to get the chuppah up and running on the same day as the date written in the ksuba. So it shouldn't be a shtar mukta.
Right.
But yet it seems, according to Shmuel, that's not a problem at all. Because already with Kiruv Nesuin, he's mischayev to the ksuba. The date on the ksuba of yesterday is a valid date. All right, that's according to Shmuel. Now, what about Rav? Ksubase de Rabbi Chia bar Rav. I guess from Rabbi Chia bar Rav, we're going to determine what Rav's opinion is. Right? Because Rav would not allow the writing of the Ksuba to be illegitimate for his son, the Chassan, Rabbi Chia. And Rav's uncle was Rabbi Chia, so his son is named after the great uncle. Okay, anyway. So it says that Ichtu bayom ve'Ichtu balayla. Well, Avi Rav Chassan v'lo amar lo midi. Islamic Shmuel Siril. It would seem that Rav accepted the opinion of Shmuel that with regard to a ksuba, there's no chisar and it's not a psul if the chasima took place the next day. And that's why he didn't object at his own son's wedding when they wrote the ksuba by day and they signed the ksuba the following night, meaning after tzeis. So the Gemara is now going to reject it. And the case of Ksubase de Rabbi Chia bar Rav is an exceptional case where Rav validated the Ksuba, even though it was written on yesterday's day and it's not a shtar mukdam. Why? What was exceptional about that case? And that is Asukim Bioso Inyan Havu. There's a bridge between Yom and Laila. During the day when they wrote the Ksuba, they started being Osek Boso Inyan, and they continued being Osek Boso Inyan and into the night following the day. And therefore, in all shtaras, not only in Ksuba, will we be machshir such a shtar that has an earlier date as long as they were Oskim Boso Inyan straight through into the night. And it would seem to me that the lumdus here is that Oskim Boso Inyan makes it one continuous writing of the shtar. There was no hefsek, there was nothing that separated the writing of the shtar from the signing of the shtar, because there was a perpetual, unbroken time link between the writing of the shtar and the signing of the shtar. The Sanya Omer Rabbi Loza Rabbi Tzadok, Lo Shanu. When do we say that there's a psul, the Chachamim will disqualify shtaras that were written by day and signed by night? Elik she'ein asukim boso inyan. Aval asukim boso inyan kosher. So I'm going to read to you how he understands why the shtar is kosher. Kevan sha'edim kfar omdim umamtinin sham lachtam al shtar. The edim are in a state of hikon, they're ready, they're standing ready to sign on the shtar. Maybe their names were already announced by the MC. I tried to hear, but I couldn't hear at your wedding.
I'm sorry.
I don't know, because
we tried.
I had the wrong technology. I don't know. So I don't know if they announced the names of those who signed on the shtar or not, on the ksuba. Anyway, and I was waving to you the whole time, Ira, but you didn't see me waving. Yeah. Anyway, so again, the Edim would immediately sign on the shtar. They're
Right.
omdim mamtinim. They're in a waiting position. They're eager to sign the shtar. But the only problem is that the sofer has not yet completed writing the shtar. That's called oskim boso inyan. And already at the time of the ksiva, the shtar already is well known and famous. They read the shtar out loud. The sofer is doing his last corrections on the shtar. And therefore, there's no chisaron in the fact that the shtar was signed the night afterwards. So therefore, the fact that Rav was silent and he didn't object at his own son's wedding, that doesn't really prove anything. It doesn't establish that he accepted Shmuel, who was Machsher Ksuba that was written by day and signed by night, because the exception to the rule is going to be Oskin Be'oso Inyan. And now we have another machlokes in our Mishnah about a get that was written by day, signed by night, according to Chacham it's possible, and Rabbi Shimon Machshir. So the question is, why does Rabbi Shimon reject the shita of the Chachamim? After all, we're talking about a shtar mukta. Omarav, my time of the Rabbi Shimon, because Savar came in Shanosan Ein of Lagasha, Shuveno Ein Lo Peros. The Rabbanan established the ksuba, and the Tanai ksuba is that the Baal eats the peros of his wife's nichse malug. But from the moment that the Baal decided to divorce his wife, he already forfeits his rights to eat peros from nichse ishto, even though he didn't write the get yet. I mean, he wrote the get, but he didn't deliver the get. And therefore, Reb Shimon says that if the get was written with the earlier date of the Yom and it was only signed on the following day, there's no chashash, the get is kosher. Because what are you worried about? You're worried about the fact that the woman, if she gets the get and has the earlier date, she'll be goved the lekucho shelo kedin. It's not shelo kedin because she already has rights to the perils from the moment that the Baal decided to be Megarish's wife. Now, I'm not too sure. Does that mean even before they wrote the get? I have a feeling it means only after the get was written. Because otherwise, who knows when the Baal had it in mind. So, Ira, are you still there? I lost the internet connection there for a minute.
Yeah, no, I'm still here.
Yeah, I can't see you, but now I see
you. Yeah.
It's probably my internet. I don't know. So again, the Baal decided to write the get.
Right.
And there was a delay until the get was signed. And Rabbi Shimon says the get is kosher because Nasan Ein Legarsha. But how long of a period of time can we allow for a delay? Right. Rabbi Shimon only allows it if, let's say, we passed over from Yom to Laila, just the period of, let's call it Shkias Achama. But if they delayed signing the shtar for 10 days after it's written, love. There's a limit to how far Rabbi Shimon is going to go to be maksha the get. And the reason for that is Chayshin and Shema Piyes. During this period of time that elapsed between the ksiva of the shtar and of the get and the delivering of the get, maybe they appeased and they made lovey-dovey, and he may have had relations with her, and therefore the get is possible, like a get yosha. But Rabbi Yochanan Omar afilu mikan v'adasari yomim. Even if there was a delay between the ksiv and the chasim of more than 10 days, we're not going to be choshesh that during that 10-day period they made up lovey-dovey and he had a relationship with her. No. In Isa the pious kola islay lamilsa. In other words, everybody knows about the fact that they're about to get divorced. They have altercations and so forth. And the shchenim, it's like public knowledge here. It's like...
right.
What do they call those movies? What are they called? Those kind of soap operas. It's like a soap opera.
Yeah,
what I mean? Yeah. Everybody knows that they're about to get divorced.
Right.
and that's called a kola isa lebilsa.
Right.
And if they got back together, then the Shchenim know about that. It's public knowledge. So if we didn't hear anything about the fact that they got back together, we don't have to be choshesh that maybe there was a piece.
Right.
Okay, then. So the Gemara is going to analyze this machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Okay, then. So we'll stop here, and I think we accomplished a great deal. There's always room for more, but okay, then. So let me wish you a great week.
Yeah, you too. Have a really good week.
Yeah, cold too. Thanks.